I want to talk about inheritance tax because it seems to be a subject on which there is so much confusion. I did an interview with a journalist recently who asked me a whole string of questions which seemed to represent the, if I might be so bold, Daily Express view on this subject, that it is simply a bad thing. And I have to admit I do not understand why that is the case, not at least from a person who seemed to be able to comprehend the issues and was working for a newspaper which was not the Daily Express. So let me explain why I think inheritance tax is a good thing, why it is important, and why it is completely unrelated to the value of people's homes. Because right now, the big issue on inheritance tax is that the inheritance tax limits at around £300,000 of exemption for a single person at the time of death mean that some houses, quite a reasonable number of houses in the UK, are, if they aren't encumbered by debt, subject to an inheritance tax charge. Now, let's put this in context. If the inheritance tax limit, which is rising steadily at this time, which is why I don't use precise numbers, but if the inheritance tax limit is around £300,000 and a person has a house plus some other assets and they are worth, say, £350,000, then inheritance tax at 40% only applies to the excess over, in this case, we've used the example of £300,000. So the tax charge would be on £350,000 less £300,000 at 40%, that's a tax charge of £20,000. Now, in overall real terms, that's a tiny rate of tax. £20,000 on £350,000 is not a lot of money. And yet it appears to be creating an enormous amount of emotion. And it appears that this is entirely related to the Englishman's view, and I think it's an Englishman's view, that his home is his castle, because it is exactly that point that was put to me by this journalist, and which I quite candidly don't understand. I'll tell you why I don't understand it. I have seen in my time a lot of clients of my firm of accountants, and I've had a lot of friends, and I'm now, and you can see from looking at me, of a certain age where some of my friends' parents are dying. Indeed, my own mother has died, and my father-in-law has died. The reality of having no parents is real for many people of my generation, but not a fact for most as well. Because, let's be clear, when we're talking about parents leaving their house to their children, when actuarially people are living to age 80 or thereabouts in most parts of the country, it is a reality that they won't be passing on their homes until their children are around 55 or 60 or thereabouts. Now, let's be clear about it. If we're talking about the need to pass on the home to provide for the next generation, this is simply absurd, because the next generation will have had to survive until middle age, later middle age, depending on how you define these things. I think that 50 is quite young myself, but later middle age for some people, until they actually get this home from their parents. Now, that is quite obviously ridiculous. It is not a basis for a social policy. It's not a justification for exempting houses from tax. So it is nonsensical. But more than that, it's nonsensical because, quite simply, if you ask lawyers who deal with the estates of deceased people what happens to the homes that they are left in those estates, are they passed on to the next generation for them to live in, I'll bet you that at least 98% of them are sold. Now, I do know of a person of my acquaintance who moved into his parents' house upon the death of his late father. Now, there was a reason for that. He's a baronet. The house in question was a reasonable size Oxfordshire estate, and there was a dowager house for his mother in the grounds, and therefore he just passed on the family line. Fine. But this is, of course, completely aberrational, abnormal behaviour. And 22 Forsythia Avenue, or wherever it is not the family estate. It is simply the place where somebody lives, with which no doubt you have good and fond memories, but is not the place to which most in the next generation would aspire to move once their parents die. So the notion that houses should be free of inheritance tax is nonsensical, because houses are not being passed from generation to generation. Let's cut this rubbish out of the argument once and for all. When people say they want houses to be free of tax, what they're actually talking about is we don't want to pay inheritance tax. Now, inheritance tax is there for a purpose. It's actually a remarkably fair tax. First of all, it cancels all capital gains tax charges. And remember, capital gains tax charges tend to be higher than inheritance tax charges, particularly if we're talking about capital gains tax on the sale of agricultural property or on the sale of businesses, where rates of 10% would normally apply. In inheritance tax terms, if those sorts of assets are passed on death, no tax is charged. So another complete myth that inheritance tax destroys farming, destroys business, is complete and utter rubbish. There is no substance to that. This is a very generous tax indeed. The only thing that is taxed are financial assets, in effect, and that does of course include houses that you no longer need and which are to be sold by the estate of a deceased person. So this is a tax on money moving from one generation to the next generation. And it's important that that money is taxed. And the reason is quite simple. In this country we have an increasing wealth gap. The wealthiest are getting wealthier, the poorest are getting poorer, and that is causing major social problems. There's another wealth gap in this country. Those who have houses are much better off than those who do not have houses. And by and large, it is only those who have houses who can support their offspring now to acquire houses. So we're generating something which is little less than an apartheid system, economic apartheid by all means, but nonetheless a system where there are the haves and the have-nots, much more powerfully than was the case in, for example, the 60s and 70s. A move that has increased rapidly during the 80s and 90s and now during the current century, where we have this big gap. Inheritance tax is the backstop that tries to prevent this gap widening, a gap that makes society less sustainable, because as the poor get relatively poorer, even if they are able to meet their basic needs, they quite reasonably become frustrated with their lot, and I don't blame them in the slightest. That increases crime, increases social tension, decreases the quality of life for everyone. So inheritance tax is vital to reallocate some wealth in our society, and is the only tax that in many ways is actually trying to tackle wealth. It isn't perfect, far from being perfect. It actually needs substantial reform to make sure that trusts are taxed more effectively, and recent changes have not been good enough in that sense, because there are too many loopholes still available for the very wealthy. And there have to be mechanisms to make sure that the very wealthy can't abuse this law through the use of offshore and other arrangements, because they are long established. Those clearly have to be reviewed again as well. I'm not saying the tax works perfectly. I am happy to see reform to make it tighter and ensure that this is not a regressive tax at the higher ends, i.e. the rates of tax fall as you get wealthier. But to say that we need to change it, and to say that we need to change it because some houses or more houses are falling into the charge to tax, is simply absurd. All that argument is saying is, I don't want to pay tax. Well, so what? Most people don't want to pay tax. But we also have a duty to support the society in which we live, and most of those who are complaining are those who are most vociferous about saying that the quality of life in our society is falling. They can't have it both ways. Inheritance tax is here, it's here to stay, it has to be more effective, and frankly, if more estates fall into the charge, I have no problem, because I don't think that inheritance is the way in which to run society, nor does it benefit in any substantial way those who receive the funds, and to be candid, and let's be clear about it, it is going to make the divisions in our societies worse. For all those reasons, I'm a supporter of inheritance tax. I want it to survive.